Hello, friends and neighbors. This is the Gifts of Glory podcast, where we celebrate and promote men and women using their gifts for God's glory. This week, some might think we'd be rivals, being so close between Milwaukee and Chicago. But the body of Christ is big, and well-versed comedy and fish sticks comedy can coexist in the Midwest. Now, I say that in jest. This week, our guest is founder of the growing national squad Fish Sticks Comedy, Whit Shiller. Whit, along with two others, founded Fish Sticks in Milwaukee back in the day, and they eventually merged with Improv out of Dallas, which became Fish Sticks Dallas. Then this spring, they formed their third branch in Atlanta, with their sights set on a Denver area team sometime in the near future. Now, in this episode, Whit and I talk comedy, faith, improv, and how that all can work together. We also talk about the annual Christian Improv Comedy Conference coming to Dallas in May 2020, the first weekend in May. Find the Christian Improv Comedy Association group page on Facebook so that you can stay informed of everything going on with the conference and other things related to other improvisers who are Christian improvisers, if that's something that you're interested in. Before we get to the interview, I wanted to ask you, our amazing audience, for a favor. If you like well-versed comedy, if you like PureFest, if you enjoy listening to the podcast, would you consider supporting us on Patreon? Look for Gifts for Glory on Patreon, or go to patreon.com/gifts4glory. That's patreon.com gifts4glory to become a patron and help us finance our growth and help us become something big and impactful for God's kingdom. We're working towards becoming a full-fledged nonprofit ministry, so every patron will help us incredibly. So thank you so much in advance for your support. Now, for this week's Devotions with Dave segment, I wanted to, in the spirit of Christmas, read from Luke 2. We're releasing this podcast pretty close to Christmas, so why not talk about some traditional Christmas scripture? So we'll read Luke 2 out of the New Living Translation, starting with verse 8. That night there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified, but the angel reassured them. Don't be afraid, he said. I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David. And you will recognize him by this sign. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger. Suddenly the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to those with whom God is pleased. And it was skipped from 14 down to verse 20. After they'd seen all this, in verse 20, the shepherds went back to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen. It was just as the angel had told them. Now, there's a lot I could unpack, and in fact, this is the second time I've recorded this segment. I wanted to leave this just brief idea with you. Everybody matters. To God, to Jesus, to the Holy Spirit, everybody matters in God's plan. If God wanted to make a grand, big announcement, he could have gone directly to Herod and said, hey, my son was just born. He will eventually be the king of Israel. Tell your people. And maybe history turns out differently. Maybe the close encounter with God changes Herod. But God has a plan for everybody. So not only did Herod know by contemporaries in the Magi and the wise men that came to town, but God sent a direct message to the average person, to the shepherds in the field. These weren't rich and powerful, well-known people. These were shepherds. These were just honest, everyday people. And the Lord reached out and said, hey, I got some great news for you. And God still reaches out to every one of us. No matter our position in this world, he still reaches out to us to tell us the great news that Jesus the Messiah was born a baby, rose and grew up to be a powerful man of God, was crucified, dead, buried, rose again. He still reaches out to us on a personal level, just like sending the angel to the field to talk to the shepherds. God is still reaching out to us. He's made the Bible, his word, so readily available, especially in our country. And he continues to reach out to us to bring us closer to him. So the gospel is for everybody. God speaks to everyone. When he says he wants all to be saved, he wants all to be saved. And nobody is exempt from God's love and desire to spend eternity with Him. So whenever you feel like maybe you're low and you're not within God's will, or God's overlooking you, or God's forgotten you, no, He hasn't. Right here on the day of Jesus' birth, God made sure that the average person, the person that has no power, no money, no influence, people that their names aren't even recorded, He knew them by name, and He sent an angel to say, hey, we've got some really good news for you and for all people. So never think that you are out of the reach of God's love. Never think that you are not included in God's plan. Because here on the day of Jesus' birth, He sent an angel to tell the shepherds the good news. So everybody deserves to hear the good news. Everybody should be telling the good news. So I want to encourage you this Christmas season, receive the good news and share it. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're at. God loves you. He has a plan for you, and He wants you to be with Him in eternity. Because whatever position we have on this planet, in this life, doesn't matter when we cross over to the next. It does not matter. What matters is whether or not you know Jesus when you take your final breath on this side of eternity. So I want to wish you a very happy, safe, and Merry Christmas season. And spend time in your Word this holiday season. Bring your family, your friends around, and read the story of Jesus' birth. And think about the fact that the shepherds were on God's mind in the middle of all this. So that is our Devotions with Dave segment. Luke 2 from the NLT. Spend some time in the Bible this Christmas season and really get in touch with the Lord that way. So let's move on to our interview with Whit Shiller. He's the founder of Fish Sticks Comedy, the host of the Improv Comedy Connection podcast, and he's here on the Gifts of Glory podcast, where we celebrate men and women using their gifts for God's glory. Now joined by Whit Shiller. He is an improv comedian. He is also a podcast host, the founder of Fish Sticks Comedy, which originally started in the Milwaukee area, but now is a national brand with locations in Dallas and Atlanta, and I've heard it broadcast on the Fish Sticks podcast. I know I can say it safely. You're expanding to Denver as well.
That's right, yeah.
Whit, welcome to the Gifts of Glory podcast. How's it going?
It's going all right. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I also forgot in the introduction, you're also kind of the coordinator of the Christian Improv Comedy Conference, which just finished in May, its 5th year. Which is where we officially met. We met online before I came up to Milwaukee a couple years ago, but it's a growing event and really a lot of fun. So mark your calendars for it's May 1st and 2nd, 2020 in Dallas, right?
It is, yeah. That time comes up quickly.
Well, Whit, first thing I want to talk about is Fish Sticks. You guys have a very good group there in Milwaukee. You partnered with the group in Dallas, and then have expanded brand new franchise in Atlanta. Or do you call it a franchise, or how do you? What's the hierarchy there?
I don't know how much of a hierarchy there is. We call them local troops as part of a national team. Mm-hmm. I guess that would be kind of our lingo. So. We certainly do have our presence in the different local markets, but part of our idea is how can we be one team across, wherever our folks are located.
So you started the group there in the Milwaukee area. You've been going, about 15 years now?
We started in 2007, so that'd be 12 years.
12.
And yeah, it's kind of hard to start an improv group by yourself. So I started with 2 other guys who are still with the group. 2 guys Dave Rust and John Guarnero are still with the group. And then we grew from there a little bit. And then in 2016 is when we combined with the folks in Dallas. And Brad Newton, who I know you had on the podcast, was one of the founders of that troupe back before we had started in Fish Sticks. They were in, I think, 2001, so they predated us by 6 years or so.
Nice. And you guys connected through that conference, because I know that Brad and Sean, I don't know if anybody else had come up that first year, and that's how you ended up connecting and then eventually merging.
Yeah, we had a couple of runs at trying to, or I had a couple runs at trying to have some community built within the improvising community, at least for people of faith, which was a super small niche, still is a small niche. And Brad was someone I got to know just based on kind of hearing about Improv, as they were called then, and a few other groups. And then when we had the conference, the first one in 2015, Brad and Sean were two of the guys who came up. It was not a very large event at the time, but it gave us a lot of time to get to know those two guys in particular, and that led to us finding that we shared a lot of the same values, a lot of the same approach to improv, and it just seemed to fall in line, so that by the time the second conference rolled around in 2016, we decided to make it kind of an official thing.
Nice. So going back to you, Dave, and John, kind of the original three amigos, you guys met through Comedy Sports Milwaukee. Is that right?
Yeah, we were all playing professionally there. We came up at slightly different times. I think John might have started taking classes a little bit before either Dave or I. I can't remember exactly kind of who fell in where, but when I was coming up was around the time that John was, getting into it, and I was playing regularly, and Dave had taken some time off and then came back into comedy sports in Milwaukee, and found we shared a faith and got to know each other, and then decided we would see if there was a way for us to do this improv thing and have some just kind of different purposes, I guess, behind the shows and the time. We loved comedy sports, still do love it, have a lot of great friends from there, think a lot of them. It just was a different thing that we wanted to pursue at the time, and so we gave it a shot, and God was pretty gracious to us right from the beginning. The first shows were a lot of fun, and our first show sold out, which was great. We added a second that night, but if we look back at the video, if we're honest, I don't know. It was not our best work. We've grown a lot since then, but some of that is finding out your own format and how to do things a little bit differently. The comedy sports format, if you've seen them, it's a very strong format, and they've ironed out a lot of the kinks over time. And that format is theirs, and so respecting that, we had to kind of figure out how we were going to approach it, and so some of that was learning on the fly when you're doing a show.
Mm-hmm. When you and John and Dave got together, was there any discussion over were you going to stick with kind of the short form games that Comedy Sports does, Whose Line Is It Anyway does, or was there any talk about doing more of a long form, or what was that discussion like?
We have had those conversations about short form versus long form, but not so much at the beginning. Long form wasn't quite as much of a focus in Milwaukee as it's grown to be. There are some long form theaters here. There was a little bit of it going on. Certainly people were dipping their toes into the Chicago schools for training in long form, and people that I grew up with and performed with ended up moving to LA, and we're doing UCB and some Second City there and things like that certainly would kind of lean into long form. But for us, the kind of shows that we wanted to do back then were short form oriented, and we've decided that that's going to be our primary focus because that's what we think audiences are more interested in, even though improvisers might be more interested in long form, whether that's for artistic elements or the lack of structure, or It's just more fun to do than to watch if you're not, well steeped in what long form is. I don't know, but clearly audiences have more of an interest in short form overall, and so that's kind of led a lot of our focus, because we do try to be audience centric.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back a little ways, or a long ways, depending on when this story would start. But you started Fish Sticks with John and Dave because of the faith element. So where did you find your faith, and how did you find a relationship with Christ?
Well, it's I didn't grow up in a Christian home or anything like that. My mom actually came from a 7-generation atheist family, so they were pretty serious about it, so serious that they kept track. And my dad was not a believer. He's a physicist by trade, and he at some point felt that believing in nothing didn't really make sense to him, or at least he was unsettled about it. So he kind of pursued things as a scientist would. He read Buddhist scriptures, he read the Quran, he read Hindu scriptures, he read the Bible, and ultimately decided that the truth was in Christ. And so he started going to church, and going to church by yourself when you don't know anyone isn't always the most fun thing in the world. So he would try to get us kids to go. But it was, Sunday morning, and the TV was good and sweet and full at that time. So wasn't really interested, but, eventually relented and went to Sunday school in church in the Detroit area where I grew up. And one of the Sunday school teachers said something that I thought was interesting. So I ended up stealing a Bible from that church. About a month later, they said, if you need a Bible, you can take one. So I felt I had special dispensation. And I ended up reading through it, as a young kid. And, certainly my dad would have had a big influence on, I suppose, just sort of digging in that way. But that was the start of the kernel of my faith. But I would say it was more in freshman, sophomore year, where whatever head knowledge I had at that point became more real and personal and present at that point. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I trace sort of my full faith in Christ to that point.
So in high school, as you said either a sophomore or you said freshman or
sophomore. Yep, early on in high school.
Was there a specific event that triggered the change, or is it just more of you were kind of in this crock pot spiritually, and suddenly you were done, and that's when?
Yeah, it is probably more crock pottish, certainly than whatever. Like you cook a turkey and then the thing pops, right? Mm-hmm. Is that kind of the difference? Right. Yeah. So I don't have that sort of one moment in mind, because in many ways I would probably say that I thought more, that moment would have been prior. But looking back on it, I think just based on the depth of understanding and the reality of it, it would have been sometime at that point, but not that there was this, one point, this, the light shone down and I knew that life was different from, that particular moment.
All right. So it's high school. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges to faith growing up in high school and going on to college and things. How did faith play a role in your life moving through high school and then beyond?
Well, that's a big question. Kind of a lot of ways to answer that, I suppose. I mean, I think the journey of faith can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I think it is about the one that you're pursuing and getting to know and trying to draw closer to who God is and to know and follow after him well. And on a human side, the other, I guess, side of that is part of us figuring out who we are and who God has made us to be. I think probably a lot of the faith journey, if I was kind of looking at it over that time, I think there is a striving for figuring out, who I am and who God wants me to be and how I am to serve Him and others. So, I don't know. I mean, that doesn't make it about me. And in fact, I think the more you go through that journey, the more you realize that it isn't about you. But, at the same time, we have to figure out how to serve well. So in high school and college, I felt like I didn't have the kind of pressures. It wasn't like the ABC after school special where everybody was, trying to put bottle of alcohol or drugs in my face or whatever. I just had to kind of figure it out, and I'm still trying to figure it out. Mm.
So as we go along, where does comedy come in? When did you find that you wanted to pursue it, and how did you get into it?
Well, I wasn't like a theater kid or anything like that. I certainly always enjoyed comedy. I was voted class comedian, but the idea of pursuing comedy vocationally or even, as a serious, hobby or whatever was not something that really was on my mind. My wife did get me a workshop to Comedy Sports in Milwaukee, and I thought that was kind of a creative gift because we'd gone a couple times, 2-3 times, and enjoyed it. I enjoyed the Who's Line show on Comedy Central. The British version was on at around my college years and things like that. So when she got me the workshop, I took the class, enjoyed it. You did like 6-7 weeks and did a show for friends and family, and that was a lot of fun. And so I decided to sign up for 102 and 103, and then you could audition for 104. And I thought, if I don't get it, I'll stop. And I did. And then at the end of it, they could ask you to join or to audition for the minor leagues. And I thought, if they don't ask and I don't get it, then I'll stop. And then it became like, I'm going to make my money back. And at some point, the hook really set, and just really enjoyed it, really enjoyed the camaraderie with people, really enjoyed making people laugh, just enjoyed the positive aspects of what those shows were and the relationships formed there. And then that became my other thing, so and that's been something since 2001 that's been a big part of my life. So can't really imagine life without that being a part of it.
I know Comedy Sports generally plays pretty clean at PG and maybe PG-13. They have the brown bag rule, where if you say something out of line, you wear the brown bag. Did you ever find challenges to playing clean, or being a Christian and still trying to yes and in some situations where it may not necessarily be dirty, but maybe kind of goes against faith? Did you ever have those kind of challenges?
That really wasn't a huge deal at Comedy Sports. They did do a pretty good job of staying clean. I mean, I might have drawn the line a little differently sometimes than others might, but it wasn't like I've seen in some other theaters, where it's kind of like no holds barred. Mm-hmm. So Comedy Sports was, I thought, a good place to experience it. People knew kind of who I was and what I stood for, and not that I was perfect about it or anything like that, but I think they kind of stuck to the same general lines. And again, we might do it a little bit differently. The thing that was different was just there'd be some situations where when I remember we were doing a senior banquet for a Christian high school. And this was, I don't know exactly what the story was with this high school. I don't know if if it's even around anymore. But they were probably more on the conservative side of things, to the point that they didn't have a dance or a prom. They had a senior banquet, which is fine. So we're doing the show, and the show's going all right. Actually, the show was going pretty good. And then at the end, one of the guys starts talking about the midnight show, which was it's not a comedy sports show. It was some things that some people at Comedy Sports were doing at that theater, and was talking to them about how, well, once you get to be 18 or 21 or whatever age you had to be to get into it, that's something you could go for. And, in most situations, there wasn't anything wrong with it, but it wasn't an announcement that tied in with what that school would have wanted. Right. So it was some of it that it was kind of a soft, it wasn't contrary to the mission, but it wasn't in alignment and pushing forward the mission of this school, which was, presumably to encourage kids to live out their faith, not only in high school, but afterwards, whatever that would be. And it just, again, there was just that little disconnect that was noticeable to me, and it was kind of like that would have been potentially a different ministry moment, which is something that we can now lean into in Fish Sticks.
Mm-hmm. So it was one of the Comedy Sports players was kind of saying, "Hey kids, if you want to come see an adult show, wait till you're 18 or 21 and come see us then." Is that
it was part of it. I think what it was, so whenever we would do a remote show, you're going off site, and you're going to be with someone. And I think probably part of the regular spiel, and he probably just kind of went with momentum, was to talk about all the other things going on. You got the weekend shows. Well, we also have this thing. And it was starting to pick up some steam, and that show is still going on. And some of the better players and performers were focusing on that a little bit more. And around that time, so there was a little bit of a talent drain, not only from that, but we had one of our cast members at Comedy Sports Milwaukee go to LA to be part of Mad TV, and he did a great job on that last season. Eric Price is his name. We had a couple other people who went out to LA. A number of them are still there. Some of them are showing up all the time on commercials and on sitcoms and things like that. And others were focusing more on the midnight show. So it was something people were excited about. So if he had been at a different remote show, he probably just would have naturally thrown that in, but without realizing, well, this isn't the audience to do it, other than he realized, well, these are 17-year-old students who aren't going to be able to come to one of these shows. So, it just, again, it was just kind of a disconnect with the mission.
Right, exactly. With the foundation of Fish Sticks, you started with the 3 guys. How did you start building the team? Was it through connections, or did you audition? How did you guys build up? Because I think you have, about 8 or 9 there in Milwaukee?
We're at 9 or 10 now. We grew over the first couple years. We ended up with 7, I think, is where we ended up with. We had the blessing of getting covered in the main newspaper here before we had our first show, and that certainly contributed to us selling out the first show. I was at church right after we had set that first date, and leaving church, actually Dave was with me, and the guy behind me knew I did Comedy Sports, and he said, hey, Whit, we're doing this big cover story on Christian comedy, and we were wondering, is anything local going on? And it was just kind of like, yeah, well, actually, there sure is. And so we got, a entertainment section cover story that we were a big part of, and that led to some people kind of knowing about what we were doing. And I got an email from Nancy, who kind of retired from the troupe a couple years ago or so, she said, "You need a chick," and it was just kind of like, do I open this email? I mean, that's kind of one of the subject lines. You're like, what the heck's going on here? Well, she was fantastic, and she had found out about the article, I think through Joe and Jody, who she knew from being at Comedy Sports years earlier. We had a little bit of overlap, but we never performed together before she moved away from that. And Andy was, I think, our fourth, and he got to know us, and he knew Dave a little bit more through Comedy Sports in Milwaukee, and then got to know us. We did kind of a mini audition, but he was also performing a bit, starting to do that on the pro stage. So that was a nice kind of mile marker to know that he, was able to kind of hang with things. And then Joe and Jody, who you met and who they met themselves at Comedy Sports, we had some common connections. We actually they had been at an event that I had organized a number of years prior. So we had some common friend groups, but I think one of our common connections probably put me in touch with Joe and Jody one way or the other, and that ended up just kind of working out. And then we kind of had that group for 2008, and then I think Rebecca was the next one to join us in, it was like 2014 or 15, maybe 2014. So there was a little bit of time when we were kind of the same crew, and then she joined us, and then we started growing in different ways with the Dallas Milwaukee deal.
Yeah, Rebecca's another one that I believe she's still currently at Comedy Sports, right?
Yeah, she does some performing there. She's I think on a Herald team now at I.O. in Chicago. She's been, I don't know if they've started performing at all, but she's going down there and taking some classes. So she's always trying to learn, which we appreciate.
Very good. And you guys I have an incredible group. I love coming to the conference just to hang out and see all the guys and the gals. Joe and Jody are amazing. I know that Jody is kind of your right-hand person in putting together the conference each year. Yeah,
it's as it's grown, it's been very helpful to have someone to do things well that I don't, and to also have someone to kind of bounce ideas off of, who has sort of a ownership mentality. We want the thing to go off well, and she is always thinking about ways to have people feel like they're welcomed and appreciated, and that things are set so they can just focus on the experience. Those are things that I want people to experience as well, but she does that a lot better than I would be able to do, certainly on my own. So it's been a nice kind of 1-2 punch, I think, for us to be able to do that. And then, of course, we've got other folks who are pitching in different ways here and there as well. But in terms of the kind of overall planning, she's got a good mind and follow through for that kind of stuff.
Very nice. So how did the conference come about? Who came up with the idea, and how did it go from planning to execution?
Well, I mean, it's something I'd been thinking about. I mean, to be frank, a lot of the reason to do it was, I think, traceable back to an experience that we had where we had an organization that wanted to bring us up for their annual event. I think it was like around Valentine's Day, and it was a big event in northern Wisconsin. It would have been a ton of fun, and we were pretty much lined up to do it, but they pulled the entertainment for the next session, the following year, because of the experience they had with the comedian that they had brought in for whatever the year prior was. They weren't funny. They really didn't fit in with what they were trying to accomplish. We had seen some of the work and bad comedy, bad improv, especially if it's going to get attached to, if you're going to put a Christian label on it or have a faith-based element to it. That's not good. So our feeling, or maybe a little more my feeling, was that if we want to get better ourselves, we should do that. But it also will help us if the other groups who people might say, well, you're like this group, or I saw so-and-so and I liked them or I didn't like them, and that experience would get tied to you. And as I was thinking about that, I was sitting with someone. This was in Chicago, who had been so kind of a youth leader kind of thing, and I was down there for this, and I was sitting next to this guy, and he was talking about a different group, but I won't say who. Doesn't matter. wasn't yours. Wasn't ours. And he said, "Don't you get tired of doing the same thing over and over again?" And I thought, we've been talking about improv for like 5 minutes here. What are you talking about? Well, he had seen this group, and they kept going to the same gags and doing the same games. And he had seen them 3 or 4 times, and he's like, I've already seen this. And I think that group does really well when people see them the first time or the second time. But at some point, it's not improv, and it's almost like lazy sketch. And if it works for an audience, I mean, that's okay. But it's also not improv, and it doesn't have the same kind of punch or impact that I think really true solid improv should have. So the conference, in part, was kind of a response to those things. How can not only we get better, but more so, how can we make all improvisers, particularly improvisers of faith, better, so that the world for what we do is that much bigger too?
We're going to finish this incredible conversation in just a moment. As Gifts of Glory Ministries, which includes this podcast, PureFest, and Wellverse Comedy, continues to grow, we're hoping to find friends willing to come alongside our work. Would you visit our Patreon page and consider becoming a patron? No gift too small, and your gift is going to help us make more amazing content, do great events like PureFest, and bring uplifting comedy to more who need that break from life with some laughter through Wellverse Comedy. Join us at patreon.com/giftsforglory. That's patreon.com/gifts4glory. Thank you so much for considering supporting Gifts of Glory Ministries. We really appreciate everyone that's coming on board. Now, we got more of our conversation up next on the Gifts of Glory podcast, celebrating and promoting men and women using their gifts, talents, and passions to honor and glorify God.
So the conference, in part, was kind of a response to those things. How can not only we get better, but more so, how can we make all improvisers, particularly improvisers of faith, better, so that the world for what we do is that much bigger too?
Exactly. Because it is such a small niche of performers and teams, it's very easy for one team to kind of spoil the whole thing for everybody because of either being a lazy sketch, or they call themselves Christian, but they're up there crossing those lines, thinking that, I can push it a little bit because this is a mixed crowd. So it's very easy to kind of taint the whole genre, if you will, by a few bad apples.
Yeah, but I think the bigger thing, frankly, is don't stink. The art form needs you to be good, because lukewarm improv is just that. It's fine. It's not offensive, but it's not exciting. Good, solid improv is is energizing. It's a shared experience. It can really be a transcendent kind of thing. And you see this with just any troupe, whether they put faith on their brand or not. If they aren't very serious about the craft or serious about the show that they're doing, it does have an impact, because people, if that's what they see, that's what they think it's all like.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So another thing that you're involved with, you launched the Improv Comedy Connection, which is your podcast where you bring different improvisers from all different walks of life, not just within the faith realm, but you've expanded that. Where was that inspiration from? And kind of talk to us about some of the guests that you've had.
Well, it's I have, in part through the conference, because the conference has been, in organizing it, you're kind of looking for who out there has a interesting perspective on the art, who has something to say, who can help bring out someone's voice in improv in maybe a new way, so that it's not just us, like our group, like we would just be training ourselves kind of in our own little universe, and you can expand it a little bit, but it is really helpful. And that's one of the reasons I think people have enjoyed the conference, is because not only do you get that instructor, but you're also, with other people who are learning, and the way you're learning together kind of works itself out in kind of fun and interesting ways. With all of that has been a deep dive into the nerdiness of improv, and trying to kind of crack the code about how to do this well, or what are the things that are the barriers that might keep us from getting more connected to our audience. And I know I go way deeper than a lot of people prefer to, but at the same time, it's something that I think it is good to explore the art form, and then you can, push the folks that you're working with and yourself in different ways. So as I'm going along with this, I'm absorbing, every good improv book that I can kind of get my hands on. I'm looking at what people are doing, or blogs, or podcasts. And with respect to improv podcasts, there are still some that are active, but there's some that I really enjoyed that were starting to either slow down or stop or whatever. And it was, I kind of wanted more. And then in addition to improvisers, we are going to have some folks on the Improv Comedy Connection who aren't in improv, or that isn't the primary thing. So we have a guy named Bone Hampton, who's a stand-up comedian, who's going to be coming on. Ken Davis, we're scheduled to record, who's an expert communicator, trains communicators. He also is a very funny person who can do a stand-up set that really works, but an excellent communicator and humorist. Laura Hall is going to be our next episode. She's the keyboardist from Whose Line. So, I want to get at some different voices that may have something to say about connecting with an audience. And that's not the reason everybody does improv. And I'm kind of learning that through the interviews. At the same time, though, as you're pursuing this art form, it is a personally revealing art form, and the doing it well will lead to greater connection. And if you can lean into that part of it more, so much the better. And so, I've had some really wonderful, interesting people kind of stumble along as I'm figuring out the interviewing side of podcasting, which is a different kind of skill set by a long shot. it's a lot easier to be interviewed than to interview. So
Exactly.
you're working harder than I am right now. But it's been some really interesting folks, and I've learned a ton. You also learn a ton because I don't just listen to the episode when I experience it, when I'm doing the interview. I also experience it when I'm editing it, and then listening to it to make sure I did an okay job editing it. So, you certainly don't retain most of what you hear, but when you listen to something 3 or 4 times at a minimum, I just feel like I've been able to just absorb so much more through that process.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And somebody that I'm still very novice, and I never thought that my years as a radio DJ would pay off, but it's definitely helped in doing the interviewing.
I'm sure.
It is difficult because you have to not only listen, but you also have to think ahead, like, where do I want to take this next? So it is a very interesting process, though improv skills do help a lot, I've found.
It does, because, ultimately you want to stay present in any conversation. And I think improv can teach you some of that, but that's always the thing that I think we're working on. And now with an interview, you have to do the same thing while at the same time having a different pressure. You're not just trying to say what would fit next. You're trying to give this person an opportunity to share what wisdom they have, their voice, all that kind of thing, and try to stay out of the way as much as you can. And I think I'm getting a little better at it. I've had good guests who have been able to blow past whatever limitations I've had on it. So
I feel you on that one. It's always rewarding when you have somebody that's experienced. It's like, okay, I can help carry the scene with you when it's an interview. So it's definitely fun to have those moments where it sounds more natural instead of like, question, wait, answer, question, wait, answer. So the Improv Comedy Connection, you've had 6 episodes, I believe. That have gone live?
6 or 7, I think. I think 7. Yeah, Will Hines was the latest one. That was episode 7.
Okay.
Yeah.
So far, who's been the most maybe surprising or the most enjoyable interview that you've had so far?
Well, I don't know. They're all my babies, these episodes. They're all different. I kind of I appreciate the engagement level that each person has kind of brought to the table. There have been different pieces, I suppose, that have been. I don't know. They may resonate a little bit more, and some of that may just be that's been something that takes me back to a certain point. I mean, the one that's fresh is the one that just released a little bit ago, and I did appreciate Will Hines talking about how he had this moment where he felt like he was doing improv right for the first time, and it was just sort of this experience of being present. And that was something that was a connecting point with the audience. And I think there's a lot of improv that does allow for that connection just by not overthinking it, not trying to be strategic in what you're saying, just trying to be in the moment, because it's something that we as humans rarely do. So when you see it, particularly on stage where it's unnatural, I think that's... that's something to have as a goal, to be that kind of free on stage, because especially if there is a faith element where you're really trying to connect with people to make them feel valued and seen and understood or whatever. I mean, those are the kind of things that I think we want to pursue. So I don't have a favorite, but that was one that I feel like that connection piece is part of the reason to look for ways to to have more of that. That's a lot of the reason for the podcast, I think, for me personally pursuing it anyway.
That's good stuff. The website for the podcast is improvcomedyconnection.com. It's also going to be in our show notes. So one thing I wanted to also ask as we start to wrap up is, how do you define yourself? Are you a Christian that does comedy? Are you a Christian improviser? And is there a difference in your mind?
I feel like this is for at least comedians of faith. I feel like this is something that people end up having to kind of work through. And it's not something that I find as a real kind of valuable pursuit to try to define it so specifically. I think I want to be a good improviser. I think I want to be a good host. I think I want to be a good partner with whoever might bring us in. I think I want to be a good person in the room with the audience members so that it's a positive experience. And part of the reason that I want to do that, a lot of the reason I want to do that is I think that's part of what we're called to do, to try to be loving and salt and light and all these kinds of things. And whenever we do that, when we're improvising, I mean, that's still service in its own way. So, I mean, I try to place my identity in Christ and that, that I'm his and all of that. But the label itself, I think, is maybe helpful for some people trying to figure out whether you're going to work clean or whether you're going to have some sensitivity to what that particular church host, if they want to bring in some entertainment, they feel like, okay, this is somebody who is not going to be contrary to what we're about. But I don't think a lot about that question.
Okay.
And I'm not saying it's a bad question. I'm just saying it's just not one that I feel the need to answer anymore in some ways.
And that's perfectly acceptable. There are a lot who will have a debate over the difference of the nomenclature. Am I a Christian doing comedy? Am I a Christian comedian? Am I a Christian improviser? So it's always interesting to hear different takes on that debate. Well, and we have the conference we call the Christian Improv Comedy Conference, and I don't really know what that means exactly, other than it's an improv conference, and it's an improv conference that is going to be, at least primarily, not exclusively, but primarily attended by people who call themselves Christians. And we do some things in that conference, like we'll at least as long as people can make it on the plane back home. If they're, we might have a little bit of a song or two, a worship chorus or something to start things off, or we'll pray before the conference itself, or we'll have moments where people can kind of share their experiences in different kind of ways. Well, that's just us being us together. As much as anything. But the art form itself, I think we're trying to find ways to have the improv we do be informed by our faith. And I think when you look at the way we're called to be other-centered. We're called to be salt and light. We're called to be a lot of things to reflect who and whose we are, and that does impact your improv, but it's still its own kind of art form. Improv is not a faith kind of thing, even though sometimes people treat it as one, but it is a tool that we can use as part of our faith expression. Exactly. Very good. Now, Whit, the one thing I do, or one of the things that we do on every episode is, before we let you go, we do what's called the interrogation. I have 7 quick questions, just kind of getting the first answer that comes to your head. And if there's anything that you're not comfortable answering, feel free to say pass. So we're just
okay.
kind of being random just to get to know you on the way out.
All right.
First question: the best improviser you've ever played with?
I don't know. That's kind of a tough one. I mean, there's so many different ways to do improv that to have it down to one is kind of tough. I mean, there's been some really great people that we've performed with when at Comedy Sports. I love the people that I perform with now. I can't pick one. That's impossible for me to do. Everybody is just kind of, they bring their own thing. I guess there's somebody who comes to mind as the worst improviser that I've ever performed with. he never made it to the pro stage, of course. But there were some times I was kind of like, what is going on with that guy? But that wasn't your question,
right? But I do want to say I am trying to learn. I feel like I am getting better. So maybe next year at the conference you'll see that improvement.
It was not you. It was not you. This goes back to Milwaukee, and I don't know. Not everybody can see themselves clearly, I suppose, and maybe that's true for all of us, and we just don't know it.
All right. Question number 2. This might be a little bit easier. We talked that my group, your group, Comedy Sports plays at short form. What is your favorite short form game?
Again, I don't know that I can come up with one, but some that I feel like paper trail or blind line, or sometimes people call it pickup lines or pocket lines or whatever it is, or who's line, that kind of thing. That game always feels to me like it just ends up working, where those lines end up falling into place in unexplainable ways. So that's one. I do enjoy even the simple games like Freeze or Try That On for Size, or some of those kind of quick hitter things. I like, there's new games that we're kind of trying all the time that I think are fun, and some of those, will pop more than others. But probably that paper trail blind line one is the one that seems like it really clicks in fun ways, at least for me.
Do you prefer hosting or playing?
There's things I like about both. I've always kind of liked both. I feel pretty comfortable now. When I was at Comedy Sports, I would ref shows, and it's its own skill set. It's a little different than playing, and so not everybody enjoys hosting at all. I love to play, but if there's an audience where you can really have that sort of shared experience where you can almost have this conversation with them, that can be a real blast too. So, both are good in different ways.
Okay, so let's get serious for a moment. What keeps you up at night, whether in life or having to do with comedy and running fish sticks?
I'm pretty even keeled. There are things where it's just kind of like if things are getting busier, then kind of keeping up with some of those things. I mean, we're growing, so we've got to figure out how to do some things for the first time, with Atlanta, we have 4 really great people who are there, but it's a market that we're new to, and the idea of what we do is pretty new in that market. So we're figuring some of that out, and it's going to be fine, but we've got to learn new ways to do that. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time with Denver, it'll be new challenges because you're learning a different market. I mean, we've always traveled, but when you have a local troupe, you focus that much more on that market, and there are different tendencies, and you start to learn the difference about what the community is like, what they're looking for. The shows can vary a little bit more, and you got to kind of learn how to be sensitive to that. And just trying to keep up with all of these things going at once, while at the same time trying to raise the level of what we do, as you know, we are becoming more of a national thing. So I don't know that it keeps me up at night, but every now and then there'll be like, I gotta get to that, or I gotta figure this one out, or whatever. So that's probably the best answer to that question.
So, without mentioning names or embarrassing anybody, what has been maybe the worst or the most embarrassing moment, either for you personally or for Fish Sticks on stage?
I don't know that we've had anything super embarrassing. There was one moment that just, I guess, comes to mind. We were at this one event, and things were going kind of slow. They had some other things going on in the programming, and no one told us that we were going to get introduced, and we were kind of hanging out like in the kitchen or something, and one of the guys was I think in the bathroom, and all of a sudden we hear the crowd kind of clapping and cheering, and realize, I guess we're on, and got pulled on stage there. There's also sometimes those moments where you get humbled in different ways. I do remember when we had a nice run with a couple of different opportunities and some things we thought were just going great, and I think we might have been starting to feel pretty good about ourselves, and then we had this other what we thought was a pretty neat opportunity that we were perfect for, and we didn't get it. And I remember asking the person, out of curiosity, what did you guys go with? And they went with a juggler whose name was Mr. Loon. And maybe Mr. Loon is fantastic. I don't know if he's still performing or not. But not knowing who Mr. Loon was and knowing that he was a juggler, it just felt like, okay, God, we get it. We get it. So I don't know if that was embarrassing, but it was humbling. Mm-hmm. And that certainly was something that we've kept in mind, to try not to think too much of ourselves, because if we do, God does find a way to remind us that we're not all that.
Hmm. So you've got Bonehampton scheduled, you've got Ken Davis coming up, Laura Hall. Who is somebody that, other than those and who you've already had, that you want to have time with for the Improv Comedy Connection?
Well, this is a super long shot, but Elaine May is who I would most like to get. She's in her 80s. I think she's like 86, 87. She was part of the original Compass Players, or at least was really early on, and is one of the 2 or 3 people, and I think she might have been the main person to write down the Westminster Place Kitchen Rules, which in some ways was a foundational set of principles for improv. She moved on to acting after doing a duo act, Nichols and May, and has been pretty much out of the limelight, but I just feel like she has a story to tell about improv that would be really illuminating. So that's a stretch. I haven't figured out how to connect with her just yet, but it is on my list. I would drop everything to have that conversation.
All right. Now the final question of the interrogation would be, what venue would you most like to see Fish Sticks play?
I don't know. I think I would have had a very different answer to that question 5 or 10 years ago. At that point, I would say we probably would have thought it important to have a certain, not necessarily sort of a certain size, but of a venue, but maybe a certain connection that we might have had some desire for. But where I think we're at now, I think we want to be in a packed room with people who are ready to have fun, and it's just there's no distractions, nothing in the way, and I think that can be almost anywhere. So I don't think about the venue anymore as I think about the experience. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some places where, it's kind of like, oh, this would be a really fun room to perform in. But that's more kind of the aesthetics of it. The experience of improv is what we are driving for. And I don't know, for me, I guess when I started thinking about venues, those venues, again, 5 or 10 years ago, would be places I wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And now I want to be places where people want to be, and the experience makes them feel like that they're at the right place at that time.
Very good. So my final question as I wrap up the interviews is, if there's somebody that wants to do similar to what you're doing with improv, with comedy, what would be your wise counsel for them, your advice?
Well, I think if you want to do improv comedy, you should want to be a student of the craft. You should enjoy that process. You should have an appreciation for the importance of collaborating with others. You ought to figure out if you're a funny person. If you can't be funny, it's hard to do this thing. You might be able to do a serviceable job, mm-hmm. but then you got to be okay with that. And there's plenty of room for people to do a decent job who might not be the person who hits the ball out of the park all the time, but you decide why you're doing it. I think I don't know. This is probably all crud, Dave, because if I look over the course of what I've done, I did it because I had fun with it when I started. It was not like I decided this was something I want to do. I kind of fell into it a little bit, so I didn't have that ambition going into it. I certainly can be. I think I have my own type of ambition, but it's usually for once I'm in something, it's kind of like, well, how can I do this well? That's I guess where I have a drive for it. If someone wants to do it, I think with improv, it's not the kind of thing that on its own typically is going to be a big moneymaker. There's a few positions that people can get, but you don't go into improv for the money. You decide you do it because you enjoy it, because you have an aptitude for it, or because it makes an impact on others. And if those are things that you find are something that you've got, then pursue that until you find that you're not growing in that anymore.
Well, Whit Shiller, he is the founder of Fish Sticks, or one of the 3 originals of Fish Sticks, now a national brand, also the host of the Improv Comedy Connection podcast. We've got all the links in our show notes. Whit, thank you so much for joining us on Gifts of Glory podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dave.